Latin America is generally considered to be the region of broken promises, and this is a big mistake. From China to Arab countries, more and more nations are interested in a region certainly with problems, but in full expansion and very rich in raw materials. To understand more today, let's talk to Elisabeth Pramendorfer. Thank you for being here. Why are you covering Venezuela right now, and what are you doing specifically with regards to the crisis?
What we do specifically is that we monitor the situation in Venezuela and we assess what we call atrocity risk factors. So all of the structural and the hybrid factors which are facilitating the commission of potential crimes against humanity. So this includes, the way that state agents are operating, the lack of independent judicial systems, restrictive civic space, state-led persecution. And then we work with UN member states here in Geneva and in New York to take measures to respond to the crisis and address these risk factors, to ensure justice for victims, ensure ongoing investigations, to put perpetrators on notice that they will be held accountable, and to really emphasize that the only way out of the crisis in Venezuela is through dialogue and negotiation, which needs to include not only political actors, but really needs to include all of Venezuela's society.
What is the UN fact-finding mission on Venezuela, and why has it been established? What does it do?
Sure, that's a great question, Alberto. So the UN fact-finding mission on Venezuela was established by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is a political body within the UN system that consists of 47 member states who regularly decide on which country situations are discussed in the Human Rights Council, which crisis situations, and how the UN human rights system should respond to it. And the HRC has been really essential in responding to the crisis in Venezuela because it did establish this fact-finding mission in September 2019 through a landmark resolution. Now, this independent fact-finding mission, it's tasked with investigating serious human rights violations and abuses, including extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention, and forced disappearances, and also since last year, since September 2020, specifically gender violence. So it's a technical body, it's an independent UN investigation that was created through through a political process in the Human Rights Council. And the very important aspect of the fact-finding mission is as well that it's tasked with providing recommendations to ensure accountability for victims. So the recommendations that the fact-finding mission produced last year, and it will present another report to the Council in September, are first and foremost towards the government of Venezuela, but also to the wider international community. How can the international community contribute to accountability and justice for victims, considering that there is an almost absolute, lack of an independent judicial system?
Sorry if I interrupt you. Just in order to understand, is it possible that the results of this mission, that the UN disagrees with a document made by this UN fact-finding mission?
So the UN fact-finding mission, as an independent,
just in order to understand how United Nations work.
Sure, absolutely. So as an independent body, as an investigative body, it's comprised of independent experts, which are really, leading experts in international criminal law who conduct investigations with a team. The fact-finding mission last September, it came out with a report, with a truly, I would consider it really a milestone report. And this report actually found that the patterns of violations and abuses that we see in Venezuela, they may in fact amount to crimes against humanity. These are widespread and systematic attacks. Now, that report was, I would say, in Geneva, across the Geneva sphere, where the report was presented to the Human Rights Council, it was very well received. I mean, on the one hand, it was a shock, right? Because it really, it really maps out in great detail the scope, the severity, and the scale of the violations that we see. But on the other hand, I think the report was also somewhat of a relief for civil society organizations, victims, affected families, because for the first time, you had a UN body confirming what activists in the country had been reporting on for so long. Now, the report was well received by countries which have, supported this investigation from the beginning. But as you can imagine, the government of Venezuela and its allies were not very happy about that report. And they actively, and still actively try to diminish these findings. Which I think it really speaks also to the unwillingness of the government to actually address the findings and address the recommendations. So in the UN political system, where it's member states, obviously the response to the report varied depending on whether you are whether you are siding with the government, whether you refuse to allow these investigations. But generally speaking, in a broad sense, I would say that it was very, very well received. And also, interestingly, I think it was because of the report and because the fact-finding mission came out with such an absolutely remarkable report that states really, when it came to renewing the mandate of the fact-finding mission, there was a really broad support. And the mandate was not only renewed, it was actually strengthened. It was renewed for 2 years. It now includes a gender lens to these atrocity crimes, to investigating these crimes. And I think it really speaks for the way that the report was received and the impact that it had. It allowed stakeholders, in particular political stakeholders, states, to actually view the crisis not just from a political perspective and not just questioning who's left, who's right, which government are we recognizing, but to view it from an atrocity angle, from a human rights angle, and from an angle that says, there's perpetrators, there's victims, and we need justice.
I do know the answer, but I have to ask this question. Despite such a extremely critical document, how is it possible? This is a question that I receive quite often. How is it possible that United Nations don't take any measures against, I would say, a government like the Venezuelan one?
That's a crucial question, Alberto. I'm glad you're raising it, because that's the frustration, right? That oftentimes, and not just with regards to Venezuela, but with regards to a number of atrocity situations that we see unfolding around the world. Myanmar is another obvious one. The Uyghur persecution in China, Ethiopia. A lot of times you have so much incredible, vast evidence of crimes that are being committed, of crimes that have been committed, but also of crimes that are being ongoing. And we see oftentimes a lack of response by what we refer to, the international community. And I think it's important to emphasize here that in the end, the UN, it obviously depends on what we're talking about when we mention the UN. Do we mean its agencies? Do we mean the different bodies? But I know that in this case, you're referring to the UN as, the international community, member states coming together, right? So this is really the crucial point. It's up for member states to actually have the political will, have the political courage to do something with the information that we receive, to act upon it. And so in the case of the fact-finding missions report, the report, again, is very, very clear with its recommendations. The recommendations towards the international community are focused on how can we contribute to justice? How can we fight widespread impunity within the country? How can we make sure that there are accountability processes taking place on an international level, or in a third country on a regional level, given that most likely they won't take place on a national level. So it's really up for member states to actually utilize this information. The information is there. We know what's happening. We have the evidence, but it's important for states to do something with it in terms of justice, accountability, addressing the risk of recurrence of atrocity crimes, but also in addressing the humanitarian crisis, right? We have vast information on the the scale and the severity of the humanitarian emergency. We have regional response plans, humanitarian response plans, and it's really up for all member states, not only in the region, but everyone, donor governments, to step up and to address the crisis in a holistic way.
We are also going through a terrible pandemic, but how are regional and geopolitical dynamics impacting the way in which the UN human rights system in Geneva, for instance, the Human Rights Council, is responding to the crisis in Venezuela? I'm thinking about the Lima Group, the role of Mexico, of Uruguay, of the United, the Europe, Russia, United States, etc.
So, because the Human Rights Council is a political body as such, right? It's comprised of member states. Regional geopolitical dynamics, they play an absolutely essential role, and they can make or break, really, if a situation is addressed in the Human Rights Council. It's not just applicable or relevant for Venezuela, but imagine, for example, how incredibly difficult it is to mobilize efficient and very determined action on China, committing a potential genocide against its Uyghur population. It's very, very difficult because of these geopolitical dynamics and because of the influence of states over others, right? So these dynamics really are making or breaking it. Venezuela, I think it's a particularly interesting situation because you have such a vast geopolitical, international, regional interest. You have so many stakeholders. You mentioned it. You have the Lima Group, you have Mexico, Uruguay, you have the International Contact Group, Russia, China, Iran, the US. You have so many stakeholders involved, which all have a particular interest in the situation and also have a particular interest in shaping the response, right? And I think in the UN, in the Human Rights Council system, it's, on the one hand, it's a blessing. On the other one, it's a curse. It's a blessing because it really gives visibility. It leads to important initiatives because the political stakes are so high. And we've seen that in 2019 when the Lima Group went forward with an incredibly strong resolution and an incredibly strong measure, which was to establish an independent UN investigation. That was a very, very significant, strong step by them. On the other hand, it's a curse because it is so contested, right? And because you have so much friction between different stakeholders. And that sometimes makes it more difficult. So just to give you an example of how that played out over the past 3 years is that in September 2019, when you had members of the Lima Group coming forward and demanding an independent UN investigation, that step was seen by many states, including, members of the EU and others, as too aggressive. It was seen a little bit as there was a concern that it's a political initiative that shouldn't necessarily take place at the Human Rights Council. Then you obviously had other countries of the GRULAC region, Uruguay and Mexico, which were also concerned, right, because of these regional dynamics between Lima Group and others. You had Venezuela and Iran at the same time leading a kind of counter initiative. They wanted to block this Lima Group resolution. And then in the middle of all of that, you had I would call them perhaps fence sitters, right? You had a lot of African and Asian countries which weren't really sure where to stand in between. And it was largely thanks to the really immense effort of civil society, Venezuelan civil society, that actually succeeded in getting this resolution through and establishing this independent investigation. It was interesting that a year later, in September the next year, the fact-finding mission presented the report, and the first mandate expired, and it was up for renewal. And because of the difficulties in the first year, we expected there to perhaps be similar, political dynamics than in 2019. But the situation was actually very different. You had from the very beginning the EU and other supporters fully on board. And I think that was to a great extent actually because of the report, because of this really significant report, that the crisis was now viewed at really from a human rights angle. And so few countries, including a lot of fence sitters, Now they really couldn't say much against it, right? Because there was such a vast evidence. It would have been very difficult for them to say we do not support this independent investigation. I think that moving forward the next 2 years, we will really see how what scenario we will have to deal with in Geneva, but also in general, right, on a geopolitical level. We have a new U.S. administration who may rejoin the Human Rights Council. We had, Argentina leaving the Lima group. You have other countries like Uruguay, perhaps a little bit more involved, or in a different way involved. We have regional elections. We have a different Human Rights Council membership in the next year. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. And it's very important, just to sum up your question, to take all of that into consideration, because that will definitely shape the way that the Human Rights Council will respond. I think that perhaps, just to end on that, perhaps with all these dynamics and changing alliances or changing national positions towards Venezuela, perhaps it will also help in Geneva, in the human rights system, to depolarize the crisis a bit and really continue to take it for what it is, which is a human rights crisis that the human rights system needs to deal with.
One of the biggest problems for journalists, not only for activists, but for journalists, is to be believed. People do not believe us when we talk about what's happening in Venezuela. Many people, maybe for ignorance, consider Venezuela a poor country, when in fact it was, let's say, a first world country just a couple of decades ago. Which current trends or patterns, if you will, are we witnessing at the moment in Venezuela with regards to the human rights violations, systematic repression within the country?
Well, I think, Alberto, what is really concerning, and I think what demands a lot of visibility, is that all the structural risk factors which have facilitated these patterns of violations and abuses, which have facilitated potential crimes against humanity, they remain in place. They haven't changed, right? There haven't been any genuine reforms of the security sector or of the forces involved. There's really no independent investigations or justice for victims. Civilians are still being prosecuted in military courts. You have the government still harassing anyone that speaks out. You hear of massacres like in La Vega back in January, at Ripial just now. You have widespread impunity, which I think really emboldens perpetrators to continue to operate the way they are. And I think the point that you just made is it's really essential. I mean, the systematic persecution, harassment, criminalization of media, journalists, and human rights defenders, activists, humanitarian organizations. This is actually something that over the past months, it has always existed, right? As you said, you've always been at great risk for doing the work that you do, for reporting on the crisis, and for providing assistance for humanitarian organizations, human rights defenders, which are collecting this information. They've always been at really great risk. Something really worrying that we see intensifying over the past months is a very public and a very upfront strategy of persecution and harassment of really anyone in civic space, independent media, civil society organizations. It includes, incidents of offices being raided, staff members being detained, arrest warrants, freezing of bank accounts. You had just most recently, I believe on the 30th of March, a new requirement of registration for nonprofit organizations, which is now asking them to hand over highly sensitive information to the National Office Against Organized Crime and Terrorism financing. And over 700 Venezuelan and regional international NGOs actually went public, and they warned that this announcement, this registry, is actually illegal, and it actually exposes people in need of humanitarian assistance and victims of human rights violations who actually rely on the support that they receive from these organizations. So it's an incredibly concerning, pattern that we see evolving over the past months. We've seen it back in January when members of Azul Positivo in Venezuela were arbitrarily detained. We had, since November, actually, we had multiple actors in the UN human rights system. We had the High Commissioner speaking out specifically on increased persecution of civil society. We had the fact-finding mission that specifically mentioned this in their March update. We had special rapporteurs speaking out on this. And I just want to bring in one of the information that is produced by Venezuelan organizations on these patterns. We had information from the Centro de Justicia y Paz, CEPAZ, which only in March this year registered at least 88 incidents, acts of persecution and criminalization against wider civil society, media, political leaders. So this is really a pattern, and it's a pattern that now authorities are this persecution happens very publicly, and there's really no aim of even hiding it. And I think this is incredibly concerning. On the one hand, because obviously these human rights organizations, humanitarian actors, civil society, media, this is the very reason that a lot of us outside of the country, outside of Venezuela, actually understand what's happening within, right? It's because of the work of defenders and activists that we understand the situation, as you've mentioned. But on the other hand, it's also extremely concerning because it's because of these organizations that populations, are able to access assistance and protection. So this is something I think we have to really give visibility to, and we have to be loud and active in showing solidarity, but also increasing the pressure on the government to end this systematic persecution.
The most interesting questions come from the public, from normal people. We have experienced many crises in the last decade: ISIS, South Sudan, Africa, all over the world. But it was always one army or one government against another, or against insurgents. I cannot remember a crisis in which criminal cartels were so much involved. How to deal with it?
Wow, you're right. I mean, it's
not my question.
It's a big challenge to think of really a holistic response, right? To deal with so many. It's a crisis with a multitude of sub-crises, right? You have a humanitarian crisis. You have, as you mentioned, a security crisis. You have, you have armed groups. You have criminals. You have, trafficking within the country. You have now the escalation of military engagement in parts along the frontier between Venezuela and Colombia. You have the political crisis. You have the economic crisis. There's so many. The complexity of the crisis makes it incredibly difficult, I think, to understand how to deal with it in a holistic manner. And I think one of the ways in which we can, and I'm speaking specifically now about the UN system, in which we can respond to that, is to just really approach it in a holistic and multidimensional way. Oftentimes, when we, even within the UN system, we think in silos, right? So the human rights crisis is dealt with in a specific, that is dealt with in Geneva. Peace and security is in New York. Humanitarian conversations are with UN, OCHA, and others, right? The issue of security and armed groups and non-state armed actors, that's something that is not addressed in certain fora. And I think what is really necessary is to just adopt a multidimensional understanding and approach to the crisis, and to understand how all of these different dynamics are impacting each other and are influencing each other, right? You cannot understand the presence of criminal groups, Venezuela being a territory for or a corridor for trafficking, you cannot understand that without understanding the economic crisis, without understanding the political dimensions of it. So we really need to come together and to assess all of this in a holistic manner. That needs to happen also in the international forum. That needs to happen within the UN system when we address the crisis.
What can the international community do to respond to the crisis? How is it possible, let me say, to escape from ideological cages? And again, would even a military intervention? I know that, well, I know your role, and I ask respectfully this question. But would even a military intervention be justified by international law if it were to prove that the civil population in Venezuela is at risk of survival?
So I'm gonna start with the first question, Alberto, because you made a really important point, which is the political ideologies, right? And it's really oftentimes addressed by political stakeholders and governments, right? It's a question of left or right, which president do you recognize, and I think this kind of rhetoric or this kind of perspective looking at the crisis makes it very difficult to address it in an efficient manner. I think that rather than looking at political ideologies and which government you support, it's really a question of who are the perpetrators and who are the victims. I think that should be really the viewpoint from which you look at it. And I think that extensive pressure should be on preventing the continuation of systematic patterns of violations and abuses and crimes against humanity. I think there's a lot that can be done on a national level to address the multidimensional crisis and on an international level. So on a national level, I think that steps that governments can take individually is on the one hand, we had Colombia's decision back in early February to provide temporary protection permit. And I think, the entire region and really all states in the region should kind of, should follow suit and should provide some form of formal status to Venezuelans living in the country to offer them access to services, work authorization, formal employment, and to reduce the vulnerabilities of migrant communities. It goes beyond the region as well. It's not just that the region has a responsibility. The entire international community has a responsibility. Donor governments, EU governments should increase their support for humanitarian aid that is available to authorities across the region, which are hosting incoming Venezuelans. And I think this also applies to the latest forced displacement of almost 6,000 Venezuelans as a result of the violence in Apure state and elsewhere. States should also really, take steps forward in exploring how can you ensure justice and accountability through perhaps universal jurisdiction and the continuation of targeted sanctions. So there's a lot that states can do on a national level. The international community as such, I think there's huge potential and there's a big role for them to play. The first and most obvious one is to obviously ensure ongoing investigations and reporting into possible atrocity crimes, as is currently being done by an independent UN body. They should also extend extensive pressure on the Maduro government to actually investigate. We have the International Criminal Court, which is also playing a very, very important role in terms of accountability. I think one of the most recent examples of calling for international action and how that can look like is actually with regards to the violence in Apure and the resulting forced displacement into Colombia. Because actually, as a result of that, very soon after the first reports back in 21st of March, we had Venezuelan and Colombian civil society organizations coming out with a statement requesting the appointment of a special UN envoy to deal with the border crisis, but not only to deal with it from a security standpoint, but to also deal with it from a humanitarian and from a human rights standpoint. Because again, it's assessed through a security lens, but we need to look at vulnerable and affected communities and populations there, and how we can address the crisis in a holistic manner.
The last question, because I'm receiving many questions, and we cannot answer all of it. But
I want to, if I may, because I didn't answer your question, of course, on intervention, and I think it's a really important one, and I think it's great to have this space here to talk about that further, because I know that, especially with regards to Venezuela, the discussion about responsibility to protect, military intervention, it's really a very visible discussion, and I think that there is a lot of different understandings of how that works. So I want to take this opportunity actually to clarify, and thanks for letting me. The use of force, military intervention, this is something that is regulated in the UN Charter, and the Charter is very clear on that. In the case of Venezuela, you would need an authorization by the UN Security Council. That's the legal requirement. But I want to also emphasize that in addition to the legal requirement, you also need to ask yourself, what's the consequence of such an intervention? What's the goal? Is the goal to protect populations, or is it to change a government? And also, what's the chance that this form of action will actually be successful? So in my opinion, just to give you my personal standing on this, it's first of all, there's just no realistic prospect of the Security Council agreeing on the use of force. They hardly can agree to meet and discuss Venezuela. So there's no realistic process that there will be a legal basis for this. And in addition to that, I also think that use of force would be, in the context of Venezuela, absolutely disastrous. I think the outcome would be catastrophic. It's already an acute humanitarian emergency, and I don't think that this is an option that is going to improve the situation on the ground. I think that, unfortunately, I think we really are looking at a very, long-term process, which is aimed at a peaceful and democratic solution through negotiation, through dialogue, and through reforms. There is, unfortunately, no quick fix to the crisis. But that being said, even though we are looking at a long-term process, there is a need for imminent and prompt measures to protect populations and to save lives. And I think that, again, the international community here needs, and it can really step up the game. We need sustained engagement by governments, not just on the political front, but really addressing humanitarian needs and addressing the human rights crisis. So yes, it's a long-term process, but we need, prompt measures. We need, prompt action by governments to provide relief and to address ongoing violations through pressure, through efforts towards accountability, through assistance to migrants in the region. We need a very well-designed response and engagement which aims to save lives. But again, I think that military action, there's neither a legal basis for it, and I genuinely and fully believe that the outcome of that would be absolutely disastrous.
And the last question, as I said, Venezuela represents kind of a systemic risk because no one knows, for instance, the real numbers of the pandemic in the country. The regime does not disclose data to the WHO, the World Health Organization. What do you think? There is a risk, maybe, in the region that the neighboring countries build a kind of sanitary cordon in order to avoid the arrival of so many potential sick people?
Yeah, that is a very relevant question, Alberto. I think it also really touches upon the impact of the migration crisis, right? Which has impacted the entire region. And yes, I think Venezuela's health crisis, in particular, of course, since the outbreak of COVID-19, it does pose a regional threat. Obviously, because there's no credible or transparent data that is being produced by the government. You had a more or less collapsed healthcare system before, obviously not able to deal with the pandemic. And so even before COVID, you had the health systems and wider social systems of neighboring countries, which were already very strained to try and to meet the needs of their own communities, but also of incoming Venezuelan migrants. I think it's important, though, to perhaps shift the perspective a little bit, because I think that while there's a risk for the region as such, I think that the biggest risk is the ones that are facing the biggest risk is actually Venezuelans themselves, right? Venezuelans who were forced to leave. And who were forced to go to various countries in the region, and who are there and require imminent protection and assistance. COVID, I think it only just adds an additional, layer of complexity to an already acute emergency. All the factors that resulted in people being forced to leave are still in place, and they have actually been exacerbated by COVID-19. Food insecurity, no access to basic services, the loss of livelihoods, extreme poverty. So on the one hand, the needs increased, and people had oftentimes no choice other than to leave. But at the same time, it became more difficult and dangerous to leave because of restrictions of movement, border closures, because of curfews, and oftentimes also an increase in xenophobia and fear in host communities. So this actually meant that communities and individuals who were extremely vulnerable before have become even more vulnerable. When we look at the way that a lot of Venezuelans are migrating right now, because of border closures, because of movement restrictions on movement, people had to look at more risky migration routes and irregular crossings, where they are at extreme risk of exploitation, sexual violence, discrimination, trafficking. At the same time, you also, since COVID-19, you had kind of a reverse flow, right, of Venezuelans trying to get back to Venezuela and returning from neighboring countries, and then realizing that the situation they had left before has actually further deteriorated. So really the risk of communities, individuals, it has been further exacerbated. And I think that looking at the regional dynamics, it really requires a sustained humanitarian response on the one hand, imminent shelter, food protection, trauma, psychological support, but it also needs long-term development solutions, education, protection, integration, and that needs to happen together with host communities in the region, because as you've mentioned, it's regional countries have been really trying to cope with the influx, and it oftentimes had a really big impact on host communities who had been vulnerable before already. So there is really a need to to look at who is at most risk, and how can we respond to that, both from a humanitarian side, but also long-term development, protection, and integration.
Elisabeth Pramendorfer, vielen Dank. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank. Thank you so much, Alberto. Thanks for having me.